October 12, 1972. A small twin-engine charter plane lifted off from Uruguay in South America. Its destination, Santiago, the capital of Chile. On board were members of a young rugby team, tall, energetic players, along with a few of their family members and close friends, 45 people in total. It was supposed to be a simple trip. A routine 3-hour flight that crossed one major obstacle, the Andes Mountains. The Andes stretch across South America and form the longest mountain range on Earth. Aside from the Himalayas, these peaks are some of the highest in the world. But on this particular day, their breathtaking beauty would turn deadly. A storm was brewing over the mountains that October morning. The pilots quickly realized they couldn't safely continue, so they made the decision to land for the night in Mendoza, Argentina, and attempt the crossing the next day. On October 13th, at 2:18 p.m., the plane took off again. Weather reports said the skies were clear. For the first hour, the flight felt calm, smooth, nothing unusual. But at 3:21 p.m., as the pilots began descending toward Santiago, still surrounded by tall mountains, the trouble started. Violent turbulence hit the aircraft. The plane began shaking from side to side. Thick clouds swallowed everything outside the windows. Visibility dropped to zero. Suddenly, alarms blared inside the cockpit. Warning lights flashed, but no one knew why. The rugby players, young and fearless, laughed it off at first. They were used to rough rides. One passenger leaned toward the window as the clouds briefly thinned, and his smile vanished. They were dangerously close to a massive mountain wall. The moment the plane broke free of the clouds, the pilots saw it too, a towering rock face directly ahead. They pushed the engines to maximum power, desperately trying to climb. The terrain collision alarm screamed through the cockpit, but it was already too late. As the aircraft tried to pull upward, the tail slammed into the mountainside. The entire rear section tore away. 2 rows of seats, with 3 passengers still strapped in, were ripped out and disappeared into the endless white below. The plane, now crippled but still climbing for a moment, suddenly began to drop. A second impact followed. The left wing snapped off, sending more passengers tumbling out into the void. Only the forward fuselage remained, the front tube of the aircraft, and it plummeted onto a glacier. It skidded downhill at nearly 350 kilometers per hour, sliding more than 700 meters before finally grinding to a stop. The inside was devastation, seats ripped from the floor. People injured everywhere. The cockpit crushed, both pilots killed instantly. The shattered fuselage lay stranded on an isolated peak in the Andes at an altitude of 3,570 meters, almost 12,000 feet. And yet, against all odds, 33 people were still alive. Many were badly injured. None knew where they were, and rescue teams? They were searching in the wrong place. It was later discovered that the aircraft was 80 kilometers off its intended route. This was only the beginning of a story that neither these passengers nor any of us today could ever have imagined. This is the unbelievable, heartbreaking story of Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571, later known as the Miracle of the Andes. Plane crashes in Andes, 45 aboard. All presumed dead. Survival against impossible odds. Miracle in the mountains. Immediately after the crash, 2 survivors were able to move. 19-year-old Roberto Canessa and 20-year-old Gustavo Zerbino. Both were medical students. They wasted no time, checking who was alive, who was injured, and who needed help most urgently. One of the worst injured was 23-year-old Fernando Parado, unconscious with a severe skull injury. Roberto and Gustavo fought hour after hour to stabilize the wounded. Meanwhile, within an hour of the plane losing contact, Chile's Air Search and Rescue Service sounded the alarm. 4 aircraft were deployed. They scanned the mountains from sunset into darkness, but they saw nothing. A white aircraft against endless white snow was almost impossible to spot. Back on the glacier, the survivors stayed hopeful. They believed that if they could just endure the freezing night, rescue teams would find them in the morning. But the temperature dropped below zero. 5 more passengers died before dawn. The number of survivors fell from 33 to 28. The remaining passengers used the front section of the plane as a shelter. They blocked the torn open rear using luggage, seat cushions, and snow to trap whatever warmth they could. On October 14th, the search intensified. 11 aircraft from Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay began scanning the region. Ironically, Their search grid included the exact crash area, but the white fuselage blended perfectly into the snowy mountains. The survivors tried everything. They wrote SOS on the roof using lipstick, but the letters were too faint. Then they arranged suitcases in the snow to form a giant X. Still nothing. That day, 3 rescue planes flew directly overhead. The survivors screamed, waved, begged for attention. But the aircraft passed by, unaware of the tragedy right below. Another day slipped away. On October 15th, they faced a new problem: water. A survivor named Vito Schrauer came up with a solution. He fashioned a metal sheet into a simple solar heater using sunlight to melt snow into precious drinking water. And the fight for survival continued. Vito collected the melted water in empty wine bottles, their first real source of drinking water. Others found their own ways to cope. They used seat cushions like makeshift snowshoes and pulled wool from the seat covers to insulate themselves against the brutal cold. A mother lost, a sister fading on October 16th, 3 days after the crash. Fernando Parado finally woke from his coma. The moment he opened his eyes, he faced a nightmare no one should ever experience. His mother had died in the crash, and his 19-year-old sister lay beside him, gravely injured. Fernando cared for her tirelessly, bringing whatever tiny bits of food or water he could find. But after 8 difficult days, she too passed away. Moments like these remind us just how fragile life is. How unpredictable. We never know how many days we truly have. Snow, cold, and a new enemy. Blindness. Most of the passengers had grown up near the coast. Many had never seen snow in their lives. Now they were trapped at almost 12,500 feet, in temperatures plunging to minus 30 degrees Celsius, with almost no food or water. As if that wasn't enough, another threat emerged: snow blindness. A condition caused when intense UV rays reflect off endless sheets of white ice, damaging the eyes. The survivors had only 3 pairs of sunglasses among all of them. Search teams give up on October 21st, 8 days after the crash. The search effort was officially halted. Rescuers believed no one could survive for so long in those conditions. After 142 hours of searching the Andes, they stopped. But the survivors didn't know that, not yet. While digging through the wreckage, they found a small transistor radio. One player, Roy Harley, who loved tinkering with electronics, managed to repair it using scraps from the plane. He even built a makeshift antenna. For the first time in 11 days, the radio crackled to life, but it was one way only. They could hear the world. The world just couldn't hear them. And through that radio, they heard the devastating words: "The search has been canceled." Some survivors cried. Some folded their hands in prayer. Some simply stared in silence. One of them whispered, "Your loved ones are alive, but they believe you're dead." But Fernando Parado stayed quiet. He wasn't giving up. He was thinking. The food runs out. By the 11th day, their food supply was nearly gone. And from the beginning, it wasn't much. 8 chocolate bars, 1 tin of mussels, 3 small jars of jam, a handful of almonds, 1 box of peanuts, some dates, candies, dried plums, and a few bottles of wine. They stretched it as far as possible, rationing tiny pieces each day. Fernando survived on a single chocolate-covered peanut for 3 days. But eventually, everything ran out. At nearly 12,500 feet, no plants grew, no animals lived, no supplies were left. Some survivors chewed on seat cushions, cotton, even scraps of leather, but that only made them sick. With starvation closing in, they reached a moment no human being ever imagines facing. A shocking, unthinkable decision, the only source of nutrition around them. Were the bodies of those who had died, friends, teammates, family members. It was not a decision made lightly. It was survival at its most desperate. Roberto Canessa, who first voiced the idea, stepped forward to do it himself before anyone else. Others tried, failed, refused. But 2 days later, with death approaching, they found no other option. Slowly, painfully, they accepted the reality that eating the dead was the only way to keep the living alive. Another disaster strikes on October 29th. 16 days after the crash, even this grim food source was running low. There was no plan, no rescue, no direction. Hope was fading. Then that night, a deep rumbling echoed through the mountains. An avalanche. A massive roar of snow crashed down the slope and slammed into the remains of the fuselage, burying everything. 8 survivors suffocated instantly. The number dropped again, from 27 to 19. The survivors were now trapped, packed under tons of snow inside their crushed metal shelter. One man later described it. "I thought, this is it. We're going to die. Then I felt warmth spreading down my legs. Because I was peeing myself. And I whispered, this is how it ends." Digging back toward life, Parado, refusing to accept death, grabbed a metal pole and punched upward, making a tiny hole for air. For 2 straight days they scraped and dug, inch by inch, cold, exhausted, barely alive. And finally, they reached the surface. When they finally dug themselves out, they looked up and saw another snowstorm rolling in. There was no time to think. They scrambled back into the narrow snow cave they had carved out, the only shelter they had left. For the next 3 days, the survivors stayed packed together in that cramped, freezing hole beneath the snow, barely able to move. When the storm finally passed, they crawled back to the surface. The sky was clear. But their hope wasn't. Standing there on the open mountainside, they finally accepted the truth. No one was coming. If they wanted to live, they would have to save themselves. Waiting at the crash site meant waiting to die. They had to act, even if it meant using their last ounce of strength. Among the strongest were Roberto Canessa, Fernando Parado, and Antonio Vizintin. Together, they made a decision. They would take the warmest clothing, the most food, and attempt to walk out of the Andes to find help. A fatal miscalculation before the crash. The co-pilot had claimed they had already passed the town of Curacao. Believing that, the survivors assumed Santiago, or at least rural Chile, lay just a few miles to the west. But the co-pilot had been completely wrong. He didn't know where the aircraft was flying. In reality, they were nearly 90 kilometers east of where they thought, buried deep in the heart of the Andes. Still unaware of this, they rested for several days, trying to regain enough strength to begin the journey. A haunting discovery on November 15th, 33 days after the crash, the 3 men began their trek. Hours into the journey, as they moved eastward, they came across the detached tail section of the aircraft, the very part that had ripped off during the first impact. Inside, they found suitcases, boxes of chocolate, 3 frozen meat patties, a bottle of rum, warm clothes, some medicine, and old comic books, but then they found something far more important, the plane's 2-way radio. Unlike the small transistor, this one could actually transmit messages. If they could power it, they could call for help. They decided to camp there for the night. The next morning, they pushed farther east, but kept arguing one thing. They needed to try the radio. This meant going back to the fuselage, removing the heavy batteries, and bringing them to the tail to power the radio. They returned, hauled out the batteries, nearly 24 kilograms each, but discovered they were far too heavy to transport. So they called Roy Harley for help, the survivor who had repaired the transistor radio earlier. But no matter how hard they tried, nothing worked. The reason? The aircraft systems required 115 volts AC, but the batteries were 24 volts DC. There was no way to connect them. After days of failed attempts, they accepted reality. They would have to walk toward the west, toward Chile, without radio contact. Another avalanche, another loss on December 11th, 59 days after the crash, disaster struck again. Another avalanche slammed into their shelter. 3 more survivors died. One man later said, "I was trapped completely. Buried by the storm, by the avalanche. The silence was the deadliest thing I've ever felt. I couldn't move. Now only 16 remained. A sleeping bag that saved their lives to climb westward into the steep mountains. They needed a way to endure the brutal nights. Temperatures dropped below minus 30 degrees Celsius, minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Sleeping exposed on the ice would kill them. Among the group was 18-year-old Carlos Miguel Rodriguez, who remembered that his mother had taught him how to sew. He still carried her small sewing kit in his pocket. He had an idea, a life-saving one. He began stitching together bits of insulation, fabric from seats, and scraps of clothing. Piece by piece, he created a giant handmade sleeping bag. As he said later, "The idea came to me. The insulation could become a sleeping bag. But I didn't just think it. I made it. This sleeping bag would make the impossible climb possible." The final attempt the next morning, December 12th, marked exactly 2 months since the crash. With no mountaineering gear, no maps, and no experience, the 3 men, Parado, Canessa, and Vizintin, began climbing the glacier. As one of them said, "The only thing we knew for sure was that Chile was somewhere west, and heading west meant conquering the towering mountains that blocked their path." They realized a heavy snowstorm was moving in, and the only smart thing to do was crawl back into the snow cave if they wanted to live. For the next 3 days, the remaining survivors somehow endured that tiny, freezing shelter. When the storm finally cleared, they climbed back to the surface. And that's when reality hit them. No rescue team was coming. If they wanted to survive, they had to fight for it themselves. Sitting beside the wreckage, hoping for helicopters, was pointless now. Their only chance was to keep trying until their very last breath. Among the strongest were Canessa, Parado, and Vizintin. The group pooled what they had, the warmest clothing and the last bits of food, and the three set out to look for help. Their first challenge was figuring out where they actually were. Before the crash, the co-pilot had claimed they'd already passed Curacao, so everyone believed that walking west for a few miles would eventually lead them into the countryside of Chile. They had no idea how wrong that was. The co-pilot hadn't known the plane's real position. In truth, the wreck sat 89 kilometers farther east, buried deep inside the Andes, nowhere near civilization. Still unaware of this, the three men rested for a few days to regain strength. And on November 15th, exactly 33 days after the crash, they began their desperate journey. Hours into their trek eastward, they came across the tail section of the aircraft, the very piece that had broken off mid-air. Inside were scattered suitcases, chocolate bars, 3 frozen meat patties, a bottle of rum, spare clothes, comic books, and a few medicines. They also discovered the plane's two-way radio system, a device that could send and receive messages. They chose to camp there for the night. The next morning, they walked a little farther, but eventually realized they needed to try activating the radio. If they could send out even a single SOS signal, they might survive. They dragged out the 24 kg batteries they found, but carrying them all the way back to the main fuselage was impossible, so they attempted to power the radio right there. They brought in Roy Harley, who knew a bit about electronics, but nothing worked. The radio required 115 volts AC, while the battery delivered 24 volts DC. There was simply no way to connect them. After days of trying, they had to accept the truth. The radio would never work. Their only hope now was to start walking west. Then, on December 11th, to 59 days after the crash, an avalanche slammed into the fuselage, killing 3 more survivors. "I was buried alive in total silence," one survivor later said. "I couldn't move. It felt like death itself." Only 16 people were left alive. To climb the western mountains, they needed a way to stay warm during nights that reached minus 30 degrees Celsius. Among them was 8-year-old Carlos Miguel Rodriguez, who remembered his mother teaching him how to sew. He still carried his needles with him. He came up with an idea, stitched together layers of clothing to form a giant sleeping bag. Not just the idea, he actually made it himself. On December 12th, exactly 2 months after the crash, the 3 men Parado, Canessa, and Vizintin set out toward the glacier without climbing gear, without a map, without even basic training. "The only thing we knew for sure," one of them said, "was that Chile lay somewhere to the west." No one could believe its survivors from a plane crash that had happened 2 months ago were actually alive. The farmer, Sergio Catalan, tossed a piece of bread across the river to Parado and Canessa, then rode for 10 hours on horseback toward the west, still far from any town or human settlement. Finally, he reached the nearest city and alerted the Chilean Army Command. From there, the Army headquarters in Santiago was notified. Meanwhile, the farmers brought Parado and Canessa to Los Matines on horseback, where they could finally rest. It was discovered that, purely through sheer willpower, they had hiked 61 kilometers on foot over the past 10 days. Roberto Canessa had lost half of his body weight, weighing only 44 kilograms, 97 pounds. Once the story spread, it made international headlines. The world couldn't believe what had happened. The Chilean Air Force immediately sent 3 helicopters to rescue the remaining survivors. Army officers interviewed Parado and Canessa to pinpoint the crash site. Parado even brought the pilot's flight chart, marking the route they had taken during their harrowing trek. With his guidance, the Army finally located the survivors. On December 22, 1972, exactly 70 days after the crash, 2 helicopters reached the site. All 16 remaining survivors were rescued. They were in terrible condition: altitude sickness, dehydration, broken bones, severe malnutrition, but all of them recovered. A story of hope and human will, this story teaches the world an unforgettable lesson. If you have determination, patience, and humanity, nothing is impossible. People can achieve things they never thought imaginable. As the saying goes, where there's a will, there's a way. That's why this tragedy is also known as the Miracle of the Andes. If you enjoyed this story, there are many more incredible survival tales and plane crash stories on my channel. Please subscribe my channel. Thank you for watching.